Well, it's Wednesday, and that means it's time for Flashpoints with our national security analyst, Juan Zarate. Juan, of course, we need to start with the big news of the week and of the past 9 days, really, the terror plots against Europe. Where does this all stand?
Well, Bob, as we've talked about, I think we're in the middle sequence of this threat and the plot. I don't think authorities quite know the full scope and dimensions of what we're talking about here. They do know that al-Qaeda has directed a plot to hit Europe, to hit soft targets with assault teams like we saw in Mumbai. But they don't know when, they don't know exactly where, and they don't know who those operatives are. And so what we're seeing now is sort of the middle drama of all this. We're seeing a lot of disruptions, which is no doubt pushed by the desire to try to disrupt any networks that are out there trying to plot. We've seen arrests in southern France. We've seen an arrest of a German in Kenya. We've seen kinetic actions, counterterrorism actions in the Pak-Afghan border region. So all of this, I think, is part of this ongoing drama with respect to trying to disrupt something that is still somewhat amorphous. And of course, we saw the travel alert, which was frustrating to many people because it was fairly ambiguous, warning people to be vigilant as they traveled to Europe.
There was some information at the beginning that maybe was not quite accurate. People got the idea that this whole thing was contained or disrupted, and that's really not the case.
Not the case at all, and in fact, I think it's something subconscious that we have. If something's reported in the news, in the media, if we hear of an arrest or so, we assume that the plot is foiled. The reality is that the news of this threat, which had been of concern for authorities for several weeks, came out at a time when authorities still weren't sure what they had on their hands and certainly hadn't foiled anything. And so authorities at this point are trying to figure out not only the contours of the threat, but what has the media attention actually done to the plot? Has it quickened it? Has it forced the operatives to go to ground? Has al-Qaeda perhaps abandoned some of the plots? But I think it's too soon to tell, and I think we'll just have to see. The other thing I just want to mention, Bob, it's going to be interesting to watch how this unfolds, because the way it appears, and we've talked about this, is al-Qaeda and bin Laden himself may have driven this plot by the use of the splintered movement internationally. That is to say, Germans tied to the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan and the Islamic Jihad Union, members tied to the North African group who have presence in France. And so it's a different model for al-Qaeda to rely on these splinter groups, these satellites, to then coordinate them and try to hit the West. I'm not sure if it can work. It's a very difficult plot, but I think that's what authorities are worried about.
We're also told that the contours of this plot, or plots, all trace back to core al-Qaeda and bin Laden and his senior leadership. And then we saw a couple of messages from bin Laden. Does that have any relevance here?
Well, the timing of the message doesn't have any relevance. And in fact, the message is very odd because it makes no mention not only of any threats or plots, but it's one of the most benign messages we've ever seen from bin Laden. I was struck when I read it. I was struck by the tone. It almost reads like a bureaucrat's message about the need to increase aid and relief to deal with climate change, to deal with the floods in Pakistan, to better assure that people, for example, living along riversides aren't affected by flooding. There's actually, he's got a 5-point plan, and it reads like a bureaucratic manifesto in some ways, where he's talking about a review of laws and regulations with respect to dams and other things. It's a very odd message from bin Laden, but it's his attempt to prove relevant in the minds of the Pakistan people, where the government has not been very good with aid relief in the wake of these devastating floods. And so it's bin Laden trying to take advantage of the moment, of the issues, but no connection to the plot.
Let's talk about Pakistan. There have been a lot of very public tensions there. There's been that strike across the border where 3 people were killed. And then we've seen the attacks on the convoys, the NATO convoys. This is not getting better, it seems.
No, there is tension growing in the relationship with the United States. And as we talked about, this is a relationship where you take 2 steps forward and 5 steps back. And you know, the United States has provided millions of dollars in relief for the flood, has committed to $7.5 billion over 5 years to the civilian government, supported the civilian government, and all that in some ways was washed away on the basis of this cross-border incident with NATO killed 3 Pakistani soldiers. That then led the Pakistanis to close some of the supply routes, the Torkham route through the Khyber Pass, which is essential to getting things like fuel and necessities into our troops. You've seen now 6 incidents of those convoys as they're stacked up in the Pakistani side of the border, getting attacked and torched. We saw one just yesterday in Quetta, which is the southern part in Baluchistan. And so all of this is very tense, and I think that takes a good deal of diplomacy, a deep breath on both sides to try to quell things, because this type of instability in the relationship only helps the enemy. It only helps the bad guys. And I think Pakistan and the United States realize that, but it's tough to calm things down.
And just quickly on this, is this a serious rift in your mind, or is the Pakistani government playing for domestic consumption, protesting loudly because that resonates with the Pakistani people?
I think what makes this different is two things. One, it comes at a time when the civilian government is coming under siege for its lack of responsiveness, for its lack of transparency, and its inability to deal with crises like the flood. Second, it comes at a time when there's a lot of discussion and tension about what the long-term vision for the U.S. in Afghanistan and the region will look like. And there are still questions on the Pakistani side of the border as to how long the Americans are going to be present. Are they going to see a repeat of the 1990s, where the Americans retreated after having been a heavy player during the 1980s after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan? So this comes at an interesting time because the civilian government's weak, and you've got doubts on the side of the Pakistani side of the border.
Tajikistan, new terror concerns there. I'm not sure many people know what that's about.
Yeah, Central Asia, I think, is at play here in terms of extremist Islamist movements and terrorism. We saw two incidents which were troubling in Tajikistan recently. A jailbreak, 25 individuals broke out. Not clear exactly who they were, but the Tajik government claims there were some Russians and Arabs involved. Then there was an attack on a Tajik military convoy claimed by the terrorist group, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, with ties to Al-Qaeda. And their claim was this was in retaliation for the crackdown by the Tajik government on mosques and certain centers that are used by the extremist groups. What's important here is not just the attacks, which are troubling, but what's going on in Central Asia. You really have a revival of an Islamist movement that in some ways is extreme, that is in some ways is fueling some of the terrorist dimensions. And at the same time, you've got authoritarian governments that are not quite sure how to handle that. They're in some instances cracking down hard, in other instances trying to co-opt, and all the while a conflict within these Muslim communities to try to grapple with their identity. A lot of the old traditions, which were moderate, falling by the wayside as some of these extremist groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir establish a presence. And so I think Central Asia is a bit at play. It's always kind of off the radar screen, but it's important. Tajikistan neighbors Afghanistan, and there's a lot of interest that we have in the region.
And moving to Africa, some violence in Nigeria. Why do we care about this?
Well, what we saw in Nigeria on its Independence Day, in its Eagle Square, sort of the center of its state, 2 car bombs simultaneous. These were not connected to Al-Qaeda, so it didn't get a lot of press. But what was interesting, it was claimed by MEND. This is the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta. This is a group that many people haven't heard of, but it's a group that has operated in the South, that is claiming territory in the South and wants its rights and revenue from the oil that comes from the Niger Delta to be given to the people and to be handled more appropriately, with claims of corruption within the central government. So this is an interesting internal friction and conflict that Nigeria has to deal with that matters to us because we rely on Nigerian oil to a great extent. And the oil markets look very carefully to see what happens in Nigeria. It's also a bit of a fault line in Africa between some of the extremist groups in northern Nigeria, for example, the Nigerian Taliban, and the Christians in the south. And we often see conflicts between those communities. So Nigeria is an interesting fault line as we look at global geopolitics and we look at the oil industry.
And finally, our last point also relates to Africa. This is a Flashpoint follow-up. We talked about the trial in New York of Galani, one of the accused embassy bombers. And now the government's hit what could be a significant roadblock here.
Well, the government has hit a big snag here today. What had been some really good legal successes up until this point, trying to put a Gitmo detainee into a civilian court into New York to face trial. It appeared to be going very well. Ruling today, though, excluding the government's chief witness, tying Gailani to the embassy bombings attack, that witness is now going to be excluded per the judge's ruling. And the reason the judge has made that ruling is that the judge has said that the witness itself, the identity of the witness, was derived from one of the original detention interrogations led by the CIA. And that was what's called in legal parlance the fruit of the poisonous tree, that the government couldn't produce that witness any other way other than through that tainted interrogation. Therefore, they can't present that witness. The government doesn't like the ruling. The government needs this witness. The government, no doubt, is right now in the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York debating what to do in terms of appeals. But we've already seen now the jury selection has been delayed by a week. And more importantly, what this does is it throws a wrench in the very notion of bringing these high-valued al-Qaeda detainees who had been in CIA custody or had been in Guantanamo into the civilian system to try them. And this has really been seen as the test case. And if it doesn't work, I think there are going to be some real questions as to whether not only this case can go forward, but whether others behind it in Guantanamo can go forward in a civilian system.
Because the Justice Department has been very out front saying, we're going to prove that these detainees can be tried in the criminal court system. And if this doesn't go forward, they haven't proven anything except that maybe they can't do it.
I think that's right, and then it throws further fodder into the KSM debate. Can you bring Khalid Sheikh Mohammed from Guantanamo to face a civilian court in New York or somewhere else? So I think this is really a test case. It's a test case not only legally but politically, and it's one we have to watch very carefully. No doubt there's going to be an appeal of this ruling, and we'll have to watch this unfold.
All right, again, Juan Zarate with Flashpoints. Thanks.
Thanks, Bob.